a perfect segue, Dr. Z, so thank you to what I'm going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes with you guys. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chuck Sacco. I'm Associate Dean here at the Close School, and I'm also Director of our Biata Institute for Entrepreneurship, which I think, as most of you know or should know, is our student startup incubator. So this is the space that we have on campus. I know many of you probably didn't get a chance to come on campus during the recruitment process, but very much looking forward to having you see the space and be part of our programs and our activities and everything that we're going to do for the fall. So be on the lookout for lots of news and announcements and a lot of cool stuff that'll be happening, including Drexel Startup Fest, which is going to happen on November 4th and 5th this year. But we have some other interesting programs and events coming up in the fall. And I'll also see all of you in the Innovation Ecosystem class, which is going to be on Wednesdays at 11 o'clock. So all of you guys who are freshmen, and I think even we've got a few others that maybe missed the class last year, we will be face-to-face on campus with that class. It's a fun class. We bring in a lot of great speakers. We try to do a couple of walking tours. So we'll try to make it interesting and give you some really good kind of just exposure and perspectives to the entrepreneurship and innovation resources that are available at Drexel, but also around us at Drexel in University City, which is the part of the city that Drexel is in, and also a little more broadly in the city of Philadelphia. So you'll get some good perspectives of what does it mean to be in an innovation ecosystem, and we'll also look at some other innovation ecosystems just from a research and kind of reporting perspective. So it'll be a fun, cool class. All right. So picking up from Dr. Z, I am going to share my screen. All right, here we go. All right. So just kind of following what Dr. Z went through in terms of really, trying to think about who is your customer, and with any idea, what you want to think about really is your customer. And it comes down to finding customers. So always look at it this way. When you have something, like, where do you start? So likely you need to have a couple of things in place. You need to have some type of an idea, a thesis, a project. You need to have something, right? You need to have something that you think is a good idea or something that potentially could be good in the market. Dr. Z's example was certainly something much more sophisticated because it's drug and has a lot of other things you have to think about from a product development perspective. But there's a lot of other ideas that are simpler, much more approachable, things that any of us could develop. But you need to have that kind of idea, right? That we sometimes call thesis. And you have to have some idea of who your customer is. And that was very much the exercise that Dr. Z went through with you, which is, let's just start to kind of figure out who is our customer for this thing, right? Who's actually going to buy this product? And you need to begin to formulate some rough ideas. Okay, so you've got that. Then what? Okay, then you've got to kind of think about, what are your most critical assumptions? I'm going to walk you through what that means here in a second, but what are some of your most critical assumptions about your idea and about the ideal customer? And then you have to find ways to de-risk those assumptions. You have to kind of look at those assumptions and say, okay, what here could fall off the rails? What here could really get us sideways with this idea? And that's what I'm going to walk you through now in the coming slides. So a little bit of a case study. You might recognize this device. It's been out in the market for many, many years, something called the Segway. And the Segway actually has a really interesting history when it comes to this area of trying to figure out who is your customer. And timeline kind of looks like this. So it's actually about 20 years old now. So it's been out there for quite some time. In 2001, when the Segway was launched, they launched the company with $90 million in capital. They raised a ton of money in order to get it to market. There was a bunch of hype about this. This was going to change the world. This was going to change transportation in cities. This was going to change how we all moved around. We weren't going to have cars anymore. We were going to have all have these Segways. And they projected to sell 50,000 Segways a month. That was the initial projections. They built manufacturing capacity and spent a ton of money in order to ultimately be able to build that many Segways. That was the initial set of assumptions that they were looking at. By 2002, they ran into a bunch of legal issues. They were being sued by municipalities because You really couldn't use these on streets. They weren't really street ready, and you couldn't ride them on a sidewalk. Very much as like you're not supposed to ride a bike on a sidewalk. So like where could you ride these things? And they were getting a little bit sideways with certain jurisdictions and municipalities. They were selling it for $5,000 on Amazon, which is, pretty decent price point. 2003, they were all recalled because the batteries were blowing up. And if you guys remember hoverboards from several years ago, that was a big issue with hoverboards, right? The batteries were blowing up, and some of those devices didn't end very well. But 2004, a few years later, all their money was gone. That $90 million in funding that was raised was gone. It kind of cratered. By 2010, now several years later, the company faltered, floundered, was really trying to figure it out. By that point, again, we're talking about 8 or 9 years later, they only sold 50,000. Remember, they were trying to sell 50,000 a month. They only sold a total of 50,000 over those 9 years. Ultimately, the company went bankrupt. They were acquired. All the assets were acquired. Interestingly, the new owner of the company, a guy based in England, fell off the cliff and died with his Segway. So he was riding, you see the picture on the bottom right here. You can see a picture of this footpath that he was riding a Segway along, drove it off the side of the cliff and actually died. So more part of the tragic history. And then they kind of pivoted and kind of refocused on niche markets, selling it to police, selling it to, let's say, an amusement park, selling it in golf courses, more kind of specialized, localized type environments. Tours, if you've ever been like see city tours and segways and things like that, you see those kind of niche markets that are very, very focused. It's kind of a really interesting story about some company that had a set of assumptions and maybe didn't get things right. So my question to you, I'm going to put this in the chat here. Actually, Julie, if you can put up the chat, what killer assumptions, and I'll stop share here for a second. What killer assumptions did Segway make? There you go. So if you can fill out the chat, what were the killer assumptions that Segway made? Get 12 of you, get a few more. Okay, get a few more. We're up to 74%. A few more. Okay, I think we're good. So I'm going to share the results. So basically all of the above. The assumption Segway made was that everyone would want one, that people would want to pay $5,000, that the vehicle would be permissible on roads or sidewalks, that they could make a quality product. It was all of those, right? All of those were actually key assumptions that Segway made that enabled them to convince people to give them $90 million in capital and go and try to get something into market that ultimately was a great failure. And it didn't end well, right? It didn't end well, certainly for many of the individuals of the company, the investors, and pretty kind of tragic story. Ultimately, they were able to recover over time, but that's not really the startup story that you want to have. I think that's kind of the lesson learned here with something like this. So let me reshare my screen. So that's a key thing here. And if you remember kind of nothing from what I'm talking about today, it's that word assumption. That word assumption is what's really critical here when you, let me get my highlighter back. Hold on a second. Where is my, okay, I'll skip my highlighter. It's assumption is what's the kind of the critical term that when you think about today. So what are some typical key assumptions when you think about any new startup idea? And any of you that are thinking about a startup, have a startup, have had a startup, these are things that you're going to want to think about. Who is your customer? What is their problem or benefit? Sometimes we talk about it in terms of pain and gains. What value does your solution provide? How will you reach your customer? How you keep them and grow your customer. Sometimes startups focus on figuring out how they're going to reach a customer, but not always how they're going to keep and maybe try to grow with them, try to grow them in terms of gaining more revenues from them. What will you charge them and how? What will it cost you? What resources, including team and money, do you have or need? What partners do you need? And there's many, many more. So oftentimes you think about startups, you think about obviously new ideas, you think about the opportunity, you think about changing the world, making the world a better place. But you have to look at the flip side of it. You have to look at what are the things that most significantly, those assumptions that you've made that if wrong will kill your idea. And for Segway, there's a whole bunch of these, right? You can kind of see it reflected in the case study that I talked about. They maybe didn't know who their customer was. They maybe didn't understand that it was going to be too costly of a product for them. Maybe they didn't have enough resources to see this through. There were so many aspects to it that ultimately killed that idea and could kill other ideas. And going back to Dr. Z's example, there's a lot of questions in here that you could ask him about that product over and above the product efficacy. Yeah, does it work, and it's being tested and so forth. But what about all these other things that you need to think about? So that's some really kind of important, critical, typical key assumptions that you can think about when you think about launching a new idea. So I'm going to show you this brief video, and this is, let me stop share here. And this is from a friend of mine, Steve Barr. Steve runs an accelerator program called Dream It. Accelerator programs are used by startups basically to help them launch their idea. And we'll talk more about those in the innovation ecosystem class. But I want to show you this brief video from Steve. He's a pretty dynamic guy that talks about assumptions. Hang on a second here. All right, share screen, audio, and here we go. All right, here we go. This is about 4 minutes.
Welcome to the Dream It Dose. In the next 5 minutes, we're going to talk about how most startups get killed by usually 2 to 3 key assumptions, how to identify them, how to de-risk them, and how to make sure it doesn't happen to you. Let's dive in. In the last 30 years of being an entrepreneur and investor, I've learned that every single new idea, every sales forecast I ever look at is always based on 2 to 3 critical assumptions. The problem is the entrepreneurs and startups never seem to get that point. What I want you to think about is what are the 2 to 3 most critical assumptions you're making that if you're wrong, you're dead. Think about that. And if you want to think more narrowly, a friend of mine used to use and still uses a great line. What's the bet? What's the single most critical assumption you're making that your idea, your startup, your forecast is going to work? Let's say I was going rock climbing, and imagine I'm standing there and I'm hanging off the edge of the cliff. I'm hanging there off that rope off the edge of the cliff. I've got my Scarpa climbing shoes on. I've got my carabiner. Just imagine that person hanging 50 feet down on a 100-foot cliff. My question for you is, what's the bet? What's the one most critical success factor that they're not going to die that day? And if you think about it, their biggest bet is the rope isn't going to break. It's not their helmet, it's not their carabiner, it's not their Scarpa climbing shoes. If that rope breaks, you're done. So what I want you to think about is you're thinking about your early stage idea, what's that rope break issue for you? Let's think about it a little further and let's use an example from 1999. When the team and Tony Hsieh got involved with Zappos, what was the bet? Amazon was already running, they've been up for 5 years. What the bet Zappos was making is that people would buy shoes online. So what did they do? They maniacally focused on that assumption. They assumed that they weren't exactly going to be correct, that they had to figure that out. They went down to the store, they took pictures of shoes, they posted it online, they didn't even hold inventory, because if they couldn't de-risk that critical assumption that people would buy shoes online, they were toast. They spent all their time, no leasing warehouses, no big software team, no inventory. De-risk that critical assumption. How are you going to do that for your startup? I realize I'm going quickly. Please leave your questions in the comments section below. Make sure to subscribe. We have a lot more coming. So I want you to think about how do you turn assumptions into knowledge as quickly and cheaply as possible. Because remember, as assumptions goes down, value goes up. This is all about consuming your intellectual capital before consuming venture capital. Now, you learned about this in 5th grade when you were in elementary school. You learned about something called the scientific method. Do you remember what it is? Think about it for a minute. The first step in the scientific method is you form a hypothesis, exactly. And then you set up an experiment to prove or disprove your hypothesis. That's what assumptions and de-risking is all about. Setting up successively important critical success factors or critical assumptions and de-risking them as quickly and cheaply as possible. That's what it's about. That's what I want you to do. That's what I want you to focus on. So that works in your really early stage startup, even as you're moving to your Series A. What are those biggest assumptions? How are you going to de-risk them with your basic idea of your business? Maybe you're getting into your sales pipeline. What are your 2 to 3 most critical assumptions going into that pipeline, going into that forecast? How do you de-risk them as quickly and cheaply as possible? That's it. Keep asking, what are your most critical assumptions? What's the bet? What's your rope break issue? That rope breaks, you're dead. Keep setting up experiments to as quickly and as cheaply as possible change assumptions into knowledge. Do that, and you're on the path to success. I look forward to answering your questions in the comments section. That's your Dream It Dose in 5.
So, pretty cool video. Steve's an awesome guy. And if you look it up, it's called Dream It Dose. And Dream It Dose videos are a really great series of really quick snippet startup videos that really cover a really wide gamut of startup aspects of the kind of life cycle of startups and many more things. But he brings up really great points like, what's the bet? And even going back to the exercise you just finished with Dr. Z, if you reflected on it a little bit, I'm not going to ask you to contribute anything on this, but what's the bet? There's a lot of bets in there that they're making regarding not only who the customer is, but maybe how people would use it, when they would use it, why they would use it, right? Attitudes, behaviors. There's so much that goes into launching and thinking about a new idea. And there's so many assumptions that are baked in there that sometimes as entrepreneurs, we forget to think about, and we forget to really address. So that's the key takeaway that I wanted you to come away with there. All right, let me go back, share my screen. So let me get my attitude back up again. All right. So fortunately, we have some really great resources. And these are books that we use in several classes. I certainly use it in our course called Launch It. And these are books I highly recommend that you kind of take a peek into early and often. I'm happy to provide copies of them to you. One's called Talking with Humans. The other's called Testing with Humans by the same author. And it's really about talking with customers. Everything is going to be not theoretical. It's going to be about getting in front of customers. If you took the exercise you went through with Dr. Z and you had some theories about who the customer was, well, the next step is actually, let's go talk to those people. Let's go figure out if our assumptions about them and the need is really true. Another really good book is called The Mom Test. And the subtext here is for the Mom Test is how to talk to customers and learn if your business is a good idea when everyone is lying to you. And again, it's another great primer. And the reason it's called The Mom Test is because the example in the book is this individual has an idea and he asks his mom a bunch of questions, and his mom gives him feedback that basically implies she thinks it's a good idea. But she's not the right customer. He's not asking the right questions. He's not using the information in the right way. And his mother's lying to him, not to be malicious, but to be nice. And sometimes that happens with our ideas. People want to be nice. They want to say, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And then you go off thinking it's a great idea, but you haven't asked the right person the right questions or used the information in the right way. And if any of you, when I meet with you, this coming fall, and you have an idea you want to talk about, and at the end of the discussion, you're going to ask me, do you think this is a good idea? Because invariably that question gets asked. I'm going to tell you, I don't know. Only the market's going to tell you if it's a good idea, because I'm probably not your customer. I'm also only one data point, and you're not going to use the information in the right way. Only the market can tell you if it's a good idea. So those books, those resources help you do it. And ultimately what's important here are behaviors and decisions. You really want to focus on behaviors. What do people do? Not what do they think they will do? Because sometimes we think we're going to do a bunch of things that we're never really going to do. We really want to focus on existing behaviors. Testing your most important risk and assumptions. Obviously, there are many different types of experiments that you can run for each assumption. The idea here, and this will be a little more detailed than you'll need for today, but you're going to create a plan, you're going to have metrics. But the whole idea is to get very unbiased feedback on your experiments and on your outcomes. And very much like Steve talked about, the scientific method approach, that's the approach that we use here. It's really as simple as that. By the way, there are different types of assumptions. There are those assumptions that have low uncertainty that you can probably figure out. It's probably not going to be take a rocket science to figure out. But there can be those assumptions that you're not going to be really sure. They're going to have a high degree of uncertainty. You're also going to have assumptions that are more impact than others. Some of those are going to be very high impact. Some of those are going to be very low impact. The ones you want to focus on at the beginning are those that are very uncertain, that are going to have the most impact, because those are the ones that are going to kill your idea. They're the ones that are going to kill your startup. That's where Segway ended up. High impact, high uncertainty assumptions that ultimately killed the company. There were other assumptions that weren't as high in terms of the uncertainty chart, and they didn't have as much impact, But those things kind of didn't matter, right? It's these ones up in the upper right quadrant that really matter. So how do you do it? Well, you run experiments. And again, why run experiments? Make smarter actions, learn something now, learn nuances about behaviors, preferences, and priorities. That's really the key here, with the goal to unearth simple questions about your idea.
Wait, can you go back to the last slide really quick?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to jump in. Again, the goal is to unearth answers to simple questions about your idea. Who is this idea for? What's the problem or need that we're solving for them? How do we solve it? How will we acquire and retain our customers? We can have a pretty good maybe insight ultimately into who our customer is, but how are we going to get them? How's Dr. Z's company going to get those customers, right? Think about that. You know, what are the pathways? Well, probably it's going to be through doctors. That means ultimately you've got to figure out how you're going to approach doctors and convince them this is a good idea. Even if the customer thinks it's a good idea, but they're not the direct pathway to market, you've got to convince the doctors. All of a sudden it gets complicated really quickly. And by the way, in healthcare, then you've got to convince the insurance company it's a good idea. There's a whole raft of things that you need to think about when you think about especially things such as pharmaceuticals. How will we create value? And how could it go wrong? These are all things that we're ultimately trying to figure out. So building customer experiments is actually key to everything that we do here. And there's a wide variety of experiment tactics you can deploy. And we're obviously not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to focus on one of these today. But there's a whole raft of experiments that you can run. We're going to talk about the interview. But as Steve Barr talked about in the Zappos example, that was really kind of the Wizard of Oz approach. It was basically, you know what? We don't have anything behind the curtain, but we're going to pretend and create. If you remember the Wizard of Oz, right? The man behind the curtain. We're going to create this perception that there's more here than what there is and try to prove whether or not people are going to buy shoes online, which Zappos did. And which, by the way, they're an Amazon competitor, and ultimately they were acquired by Amazon for, I forget how much money, but, you know, billions of dollars. So, you know, really great success story. But they didn't start by building out warehouses and buying all this inventory and doing all this stuff. They just tried to prove whether or not they could reach their customer and people would want to buy sneakers online, and they could manage the customer service experience. That was really what was critical to them. The interview, again, is the most critical thing. Another way that we look at this is something called the truth curve. So you would look at it this way. Again, you have an axis. You have believability of information and you have level of effort. And as time goes on, the level of effort goes up in terms of the types of experiments that you do, because the interview is quite easy, but having a live product in business is actually quite hard, as you might expect. And there are other experiments along the way that you can run. Level of effort goes up, but the believability also goes up. So if you're going initially just talking with people, doing an interview, low level of effort, but also you got to be careful of the believability of the information, especially as you think about how do you construct a very good quality interview. Over time, more effort, but believability goes up. And that's really, again, what you're aiming for as a startup. You're trying to really, again, de-risk those critical assumptions, but you've got to do more and more work over time in order to get there. So again, the simplest is the interview. And it's you know, interviews can be pretty simple to construct. And by the way, we're not talking about online surveys. We avoid online surveys in the early days of startup because surveys are very hard to construct. They don't give you the right information. They don't allow you to do follow-ups. They don't give you good insights into behaviors. They tend to be theoretical. Ditch the survey. You got to sit down in front of people and ask them these types of questions and focus, again, as I talked about, on behaviors, not intentions. And ask them, how do you solve the problem today? Why do you bother? What are the implications? What's difficult about your current approach? Talk me through the last time the problem happened, your workflow. What else have you tried? Where's the money come from this? What keeps you up at night? These are just, you know, examples of types of questions you could ask. And again, going back to Dr. Z's examples, if you had an idea about, okay, I think my target customer is a 15 to 20-year-old male, you got to go find those people and start asking these questions, right? Ask them these difficult questions about behaviors and the challenges they've had, let's say, with birth control. And you begin to construct experiments that gives you real information and behavioral feedback. The last thing you would want to do is sit down in front of the person and say, hey, I've got a new male contraceptive pill. Would you be interested in it? Because all of a sudden you're biasing the conversation and somebody might say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I would definitely do it. And they're never going to do it because you didn't really get insights into what they've done in the past and what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and how difficult maybe existing solutions are. You also want to find out who else should I talk to. Every person you go interview, try to get to 2 or 3 other people from that one person. If you're sitting there saying, wow, I got to go talk to 10 people, but I don't know 10 people, well, start with one. And that one person, especially if they're in your target market, probably know a few other people that you can go talk to. And then you also want to expand your knowledge. What else should I have asked? Is there anything else I've missed here that maybe is in the back of somebody's head and they're wondering, why didn't I ask that question? Throw that out there, give them that opening to ask you those questions. So that's basically the interview. And you always want to kind of think about constructing this the right way to avoid bad approaches. Again, let me tell you about my idea, bad approach. Don't ask leading questions. Don't ask generics or opinions like, would you do this? Might you do this? How much would you pay for it? Terrible questions because they don't give you great insights. And you know, you kind of get bad data, and the kind of the ways you think about it would be if you hear things like I always or never or I would or I will or I might or I could, it just again doesn't give you good practical hardcore feedback that you really need in order to really assess not only do you have a good idea, but are you talking to the right people? Because many of you, and again in the Dr. Z's example, you know, thought about this maybe in different ways. Okay, maybe all those are right, maybe none of those are right, maybe some of those are right. That's the job. That's what you've got to figure out, and has really, in some respects, nothing to do with the product and has everything to do with the customer. And just final tips on this. You always want to optimize for learning. You always want to be, especially when you're launching a new idea, you want to be a learning factory, right? You want to be in constant learning mode. Don't assume you know everything, because you don't. I've made that mistake in my career as an entrepreneur, making assumptions, thinking we knew everything about our customer when we knew very little about our customer and their behaviors. Speed and intensity is important. Qualitative insights, while the scientific method is more quantitative, qualitative is important also. Challenging yourself, especially your assumptions, making this part of your company's DNA becomes really, really important. And as I wrap up here, just another minute or two, just an example of an experiment. So here's the structure. And again, Steve Barr talked about the scientific.
I think you might be muted.
I don't think I am.
No, I can hear you.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, hopefully you can.
Yeah, you're good.
Yep. So it looks like this. You have a hypothesis. An hypothesis is structured like this. I believe my target customer will do this action or use this solution for this reason. That's your initial hypothesis. You have a test. A test would be an interview, but there are many other types of tests like we talked about. But we're going to say we're going to test by talking to a certain number of people in a certain place. And the analysis is, if I am right about my hypothesis and I put some number on that, I put some percentage, that basically indicates that they will take that desired action. That's my analysis. So that's a little bit how you structure it. An example would be, practical example would be this. I believe, I have an assumption that 20 master degree students, MBA students, will pay for and spend an entire Saturday attending a workshop to learn about how to start their own business because they have great curiosity about startups. So this is an assumption I'm making. I believe that I can find 20 students who will spend an entire Saturday with me and they will have paid for it. Hypothesis one, I have 3 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 is they will want to show up on a Saturday. That's a pretty important hypothesis. Hypothesis 2 is they'll actually want to pay for it. Hypothesis 3 is they believe entrepreneurship is an important skill. So I have 3 pretty important hypotheses here. Now, as I construct my experiment, I'm going to probably focus on one initially. Which one might be the most critical? All right. I'm going to say, you know what? Number 2 is the most critical. I think that's the one that probably everything kind of falls on, because I can probably play with the timing, and I can probably, you know, they probably, most people think entrepreneurship is an important skill, but do they really want to pay for it? That's my riskiest assumption. All right. So how will I do this? I'm going to design a test. My test is I'm going to go interview 20 students on campus. I'm going to ask them how much money they or their employer, because sometimes these types of things are paid for by employers, how much have they spent previously on skills workshops, skills development workshops. I'm not asking them how much might they spend. I'm not asking them, would you spend? I'm not asking them, you know, do you think it's a good idea? How much have they spent in the past? That's what I want to know. And if I'm right about my idea, then basically my indicator is going to be more than 50% say they or their employer have previously paid for a workshop in the amount of at least $999, because that's another, I didn't put it in the prior list, but that's kind of an assumption about price point. So I'm going to go talk to 20 of them. And if more than 50% say, yep, in the past, I or my employer have paid that much for a skills workshop, then I might be onto something. I still have to go test those other assumptions. I still have to test the price point. I still have to test whether or not they want to show up on a Saturday. There's other things I need to test here. But if I don't get that one right, I'm probably screwed. I probably don't have a business here. And that's the approach. That's the approach that we take. Lastly, and then we'll be done here. When you're thinking about these customer interviews and how do you build a script, and if you're chomping at the bit to do something now, you'll see at this link here, customerdevlabs.com/script is, and I'll actually stop share here for a second and go to that page. It's a really cool website. Come on, hold on a minute. Don't share. There we go. Very cool website. You can see it here on the screen that allows you to create the script, and it allows you to create them for different types of businesses. Some businesses are B2B because you're selling something to a business. Some businesses are B2C, you're selling to end consumers. So different types of businesses, you indicate the role, who's your customer role. So what's basically your assumptions about the type of person you'll be selling to? What's the hypothesized problem? So basically what's the problem you're trying to solve and the need you're trying to fill? And what's the context? In other words, you can see a good example there. In other words, what's the environment, the situation in which that problem happens? And then you generate the script. And ultimately it comes out to you with a really cool script. And let me go back to the other share. I know there's a way to not do it this way, but I'm too lazy. Sorry, Julie. But ultimately generates something that gives you a basic starting script to focus on that looks like something on the right side here. And it just gives you a starting point, because there'll be more questions you want to ask, but it gives you something just as a way to get started and gives you some clues and cues to listen for. So there's a question, and then you really want to listen for certain things. And again, that's why sitting down face-to-face is so important. It's so critical to really look your potential customer in the eye and really understand who they are, or understand that, you know what, my assumptions about who I thought my customer is completely wrong. And that happens all the time. So before you go and try and build too much product and too much of the wrong stuff, the idea here is let's really understand our customer. And that's really the name of the game here. So I always ask my students this, especially in our launching class, like, what's your killer assumption? What's going to kill your idea? And what do you want to learn today, as opposed to working on something for a year and then you find it out? I'd rather you kill your idea today by finding out something you should know today than spending a year on something and then finding it out. It's just, it doesn't make sense. What's your killer assumption? What can kill your business? What can kill your idea? So critical. That's it for me today. There's my email, Twitter, LinkedIn. Please connect with me. I look very much forward to seeing you guys in class in the fall. It's going to be exciting. We're so excited to be back on campus. And if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, raise your hand, jump through hoops, whatever you need to do. But with that, Julie, I think we're done on time, right? A couple minutes over.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Cool.
Perfect.